This is a brief presentation about the Florida Registered Paralegal, we call it the FRP program. First of all, there are 3 levels of regulation that are discussed in some of the literature about paralegals. There is registration, certification, and licensure. Registration is the subject of this presentation. Certification is where a paralegal takes an exam through a non-governmental organization like NALA or NIFPA, and they earn credentials that apply to a form of certification by a non-governmental body. Licensure, so far, except for an example that I'm going to tell you about in a little bit in Washington, is pretty much non-existent in the realm of paralegals. Registration is the subject of this particular, as I pointed out, of this presentation. First of all, a little bit of history of the Florida Registered Paralegal. The Florida legislature was asked 2 times by a Florida paralegal organization in the Orlando area to have mandatory regulation for paralegals. The legislation was proposed both times, and both times died in committee. The reason that this organization felt that there was a good rationale for needing to have the regulation of the paralegals was because surveys were indicating that 78% of the population of just ordinary people out there were of the belief that paralegals were licensed by the state. The truth is they are not. I mentioned that when I introduced this presentation. So in Florida, no paralegal possesses a paralegal license. There's no such thing. The problem that this organization of Florida paralegals began to recognize was that people are calling themselves paralegals when they're not really paralegals. And so there was a concern that the public would be of the belief that, since 78% of the public believes that paralegals have license, and then people go out and call themselves paralegals, and we talked about document preparation companies, about legal services technicians, that they don't practice law at all. They work directly for the public as scriveners, as document preparers. But because they possess this name paralegals, the fear is that they lead people out there to believe that the paralegal is a licensed individual, a person licensed by the state to do the job they're doing, and as I already pointed out, they're not. So it was about this dynamic of calling themselves paralegals and the world thinking, wow, they must have a license. They must be regulated in some way. And in fact, they're not regulated. Paralegals are not regulated on a private or a public basis. The Florida Alliance of Paralegal Associates is the group that felt this need was in order. And I asked the question, it begs the question, why do you think there's a need for it? And again, it relates right back into those 2 points I made in the last slide. Deceiving people into thinking they're hiring a qualified person when they're not, and that it would protect the public if there were guidelines for minimum educational standards and continuing education for paralegals in the state of Florida. And remember, this is all state of Florida stuff. It's nothing with the federal government. And the Florida Bar disagreed. They said that any person who practices law without a license is potentially going to harm the public. So only licensed people practice law. Therefore, the deceit is all just in a lack of understanding of what the paralegal profession really is, and that there is no way that it's a harm to the public if a person that doesn't have a license to practice law practices law. All right. So the Florida Bar disagreed with the need for regulation, and one of the there will be a lot of economic consequences anyway to changing the strategy that much in Florida. So we'll go into that in the next slide. The public's need for it of the Florida Registered Paralegal Regulations, is again protective, and so it was eventually enacted. It's actually through the Florida Supreme Court. We'll get to that in a minute too. But they're protective and it's voluntary. So in 2008, the Florida Registered Paralegal Program came into being, but because of the possible economic consequences, the state Supreme Court, the Florida State Supreme Court, said we're not going to require this registration of any paralegal. It's totally voluntary. So if you don't sign up, it doesn't affect anyone who's a paralegal. And that's where it still sits today. The mandatory aspect of doing this as a mandatory requirement has not met with much recommendation, primarily because if you think about it, they were concerned that if they said, okay, all paralegals are required to be registered, it would put some people out of work. They wouldn't be able to shift to a new job. What would they do if I'm a paralegal and I'm not registered? Then I wouldn't have a job. I'd be out of work. And that's because of the as we'll see in a minute, I have a matrix of the entire what the requirements are to be a registered paralegal. But it comes down to, this is the Registered Paralegal Program adopted in 2008, and this is a hyperlink right here that you can go to. If you click on the hyperlink, it should work, and look at you can read some information about it. Again, it's voluntary. The person has to be qualified pursuant to the Florida Bar definition, which we'll look at here in just a minute. And the qualifications involve education, training, or work experience. And we talked in Chapter 2 about this idea of supervision of an attorney, someone supervising and delegating substantive work. And this comes back in that definition of the ABA and the NALA, National Association of Legal Assistants, comes back into play with the Florida Registered Paralegal Program. That in order to call yourself a paralegal under the Registered Paralegal Program in Florida, you have to have this quality and of being supervised by an attorney and being delegated substantive legal work from an attorney instead of, for example, having some other working directly for the public. That's what I'm getting at. So these are the requirements. This is Chapter 20, or this is a table where someone very kindly let me use their table of requirements. She works for a law firm, and she broke this down into nice little bits and pieces, which I just love. This is Chapter 20 of the Rules Regulating the Florida Bar. You're going to learn more about the rules regulating the Florida Bar in a future lesson. Became effective 3/1/2008. Here is the rule number 20-3.1, and 20, this illustrates every time you see this in the rules regulating the Florida Bar, when you see 20 or 1 or 4 or whatever, that's the chapter number. And then this is the section number, 3.1A1. And what they did when they developed this was established who was qualified to become an FRP. So a person with a bachelor's, this is the education section, and this is the work experience section. And it also takes into account some folks who have a national certificate, like the National Association of Legal Assistants. And whether or not they require an attorney to attest to the paralegal's work experience, and whether there's a fee and a form to fill out. As you can see, in all cases, there is a fee and a form to fill out. All right. But a bachelor's if you have a bachelor's from an approved legal program, and what they mean is approved by, for example, our school. Well, schools are approved by the American Bar Association. So an approved versus accredited, they're two different things. An approved program plus a year of work experience. You don't need to have a national certificate, but you do need to have an attorney attest to your 1 year of experience. Here, bachelor's from an accredited program. An accredited program is a school that's accredited by a accreditation agency. It's different from ABA approval. All right, two different things. But there, if you have your bachelor's degree from an accredited program and 3 years of experience, you go across the board and you see a national certificate isn't required, but you do need the attorney to attest to your work experience, and you need the registration form. An associate's, if you have an associate's from an approved paralegal program, it's 2 years experience, but if you have an associate's from an accredited program, it's 4 years experience. Here, if you have a Juris Doctorate from an ABA accredited program and 1 year of work experience, you don't need a certificate, but you can get registered. So if you don't have, if you are how do I put it? If you have the national certificate, so say you have no work experience and you have the national certificate as required by the NFPA, National Federation for Paralegal Associations, and you're in good standing, and the attorney attests to your work experience under the same qualifications that NFPA requires for membership in NFPA, then you can become registered. Here we have under this is subsection B, subsection B1, and NALA. So if you're NALA certified and for NALA membership and you fit into their criteria for work experience, an attorney will attest to that. You can get your registration. Lastly, this one is irrelevant today. This last one, subsection C, and this is saying that you don't need any education or national certification. And if you worked 5 of the last 8 years, and you can get an attorney to attest to it, you could fall into this group. But notice it says you have to apply within 3 years of the rule's effective date. So as of 3/1/2011, this was no longer possible. So we could scratch that off, because if you haven't applied for it under this criteria, then you can't now do that. You have to go get certified or get an education, or both. Okay, some of the national trends real quick. No other state other than Florida has a registered paralegal designation. They have some state certifications out there. These are not certifications related to the NALA or the NFPA certifications talked about earlier. Washington Supreme Court recently, in September 2012, adopted what they're calling a limited license legal technician. It's pretty exciting on the paralegal front. Right now, Florida, they've knocked this idea around a little bit, and there's a committee that's covering some thoughts about it. But I don't expect that to happen anytime in the very, very near future. But let's face it, some of these areas of high need for the public, like here they have the examples of family matters, wills, adoptions, bankruptcy, and look, they're not document handlers who do this. These people in the Washington program can literally go to court with their client. It's just they're doing specific areas of law. They're introducing it slowly, and to be careful not to overwhelm, because law schools are actually having to be adjunct trainers of some of these folks that are going through this LLLT. Um, uh, Getting their credentials, they have to go through a law school, but they don't go to law school. They just have assistance of a program that is overseen by a law school. So it's a big endeavor when a state decides to do this. It takes a lot of effort, and some good articles about there in Paralegal Today. I'm sure if you run an internet search. Also, here's one I found that I've linked to in this presentation that you can take a look at. So that is the present what's going on in Florida Registered Paralegal Program, and some of the national trends. Now, I don't know if this presentation will stop when I press this link. I'm just getting used to doing this in the first place, so bear with me. Let me see if it still runs. I don't know. No. No, it didn't. It didn't let me show you the link. But anyway, this is it. Look forward to some other changes. Hopefully, they'll be positive and really truly to help provide service to the public without being such a threat is a good idea.